There is still sound in Potlatch, though you can't really speak of turning it up. It's already loud in a peculiar way, with bits of news from the regular papers running into ultimatums and warnings, which shift into passwords, which themselves make up a secret language that presents itself as public speech. The loudness of the sound is in its aura of spontaneous generation. The voice seems to come out of nowhere, and no accounting of ancestors or familiars, even present on the page, can quite dim that sensation. The old news remains new because the world has turned as if none of it happened. The voice carries the shock of displacement, and it is strong enough to turn displacement into a value. There's no formal displacement in Potlatch, with screaming juxtapositions and colored type overlays exploding incoherent essays printed upside down. Berlin Dada journals were paper cabarets. This is not. This is just a sheet of carefully typed words forming grammatical sentences that make neat paragraphs following each other down conventionally sized pages. The displacement is invisible, a time-destroying voice coming off a stenciled piece of paper, a voice whose content is so disproportionate to its form that one or the other seems like a trick. Compared to Potlatch, the printed illustrated numbers of Internationale Lettrist are official culture. Compared to them, Potlatch is a return to the clandestine newsletters that hundreds of French resistance groups produced throughout the occupation. Quote, in a world where books have long lost all likeness to books, end of quote, situationist familiar Adorno wrote then, quote, the real book can no longer be one. If the invention of the printing press inaugurated the bourgeois era, the time is at hand for its repeal by the mimeograph, end of quote. The LI put out Potlatch from 22 June 54 to 22 May 57. Number 29, the final issue, 5 November 1957, carried the legend Bulletin de Information de l'Internationale Situationiste, and the LI swallowed its tail. We're not interested in a fond place in your memories, read Potlatch Directions for Use, number 2, 29 June 1954, but concrete powers are at stake. A few hundred people haphazardly determine the thought of the epoch. Whether they know it or not, they are at our disposal. By sending Potlatch to people effectively positioned, you can interrupt the circuit when and where we please. We can interrupt the circuit when and where we please. You found the thing on your desk if you worked for a newspaper or the government, or maybe you found it in your mailbox. Quote, some readers have been chosen arbitrarily. End of quote. You picked names out of the phone book? I asked Woolman. Let's not exaggerate, he said. We didn't have a phone book. For that matter, we didn't have a phone. Maybe you found it in the street, a throwaway since the odds were at best 1 in 2 that those who got it read it. You have a chance to be one of them. As Debord would say, Potlatch was a gift, an offering of non-saleable goods, previously unpublished desires and questions, and only their thorough analysis by others can constitute a return gift. It was an attempt to start a conversation, though, in which everyone would want to take part and that could only end in the discovery of a new language, with a new subject, which was to say a new idea of social life. Potlatch is the most engaged publication in the world, number 1 began, the letters slightly blurred, the keys of the typewriter obviously worn. Quote, we are working toward the conscious and collective establishment of a new civilization, end of quote. The LI was playing with another metaphor. The ethnographic dictionary defined Potlatch as to consume. But the context the word called up was not commercial consumption, but, quote, consumed by the fire, end of quote. It meant a gift that had to be returned until there was nothing left to give. It was a Chinook word used by the Kwakiutl of British Columbia, the Tlingit of Alaska, Amerindian tribes first studied by anthropologists at the end of the 19th century. These tribes, the anthropologist discovered, had a strange practice. One chief met another and offered gifts. The second chief had to respond in kind, but on a higher plane of value. That was the potlatch. The game might begin with the presentation of a necklace and end with the burning of a town, with a tribe burning its own town, thus raising the obligations of its rival to an almost impossible level. The potlatch was part of a festival, accompanied by storied songs, dances, and the conferral of new names on the great givers. Quote, whose property is eaten in feasts, end of quote. Quote, causing trouble all around, end of quote. Quote, the dance of throwing away property, end of quote. It could be a symbolic exchange of courtesies and pieties brought forth by a wedding or a funeral, and it could be a symbolic war, an exchange of challenges and humiliations. There was something in it of D.H. Lawrence's idea of democracy, quote, if you can call it an idea, end of quote. Two people meeting on a road, and instead of passing by with eyes averted, pausing, like Arthur and Lancelot, for a confrontation, quote, between their very souls, end of quote, thus setting free the, quote, brave, reckless gods, end of quote, within. Quote, now damn the consequences we have met, end of quote. For one tribe to fail to rise to the provocation of another was to admit that it valued property, mere things, more than honor. A chief who distributed the wealth of his tribe was said to, quote, swallow the tribes, end of quote, that received it. Quote, the ideal, end of quote, sociologist Marcel Mauss wrote in 1925 in The Gift, quote, is to give a potlatch and not have it returned, end of quote. This was no cultural anomaly, Mauss said. The potlatch was an echo of the Golden Age, a survival of a once universal form of exchange. At its deepest level, it was a form of communication between people who held nothing back. It was a protean economy of emotion and play, as suffused with faith as the modern market was with cynicism. And it was absolute, quote, we are here confronted with total prestation, payment, in the sense that the whole clan, through the intermediacy of its chief, makes contracts involving all its members and everything it possesses, end of quote. It was no matter to Mauss that after all the skins and animals were gone, the potlatch could end in an orgy of enslavement and human sacrifice. And no accident that Mauss was the nephew and collaborator of Emile Durkheim, theorist of the division of labor. Mauss saw the potlatch as a negation of division, as an affirmation of community. It was, he said, the first round table, quote, from which none need be excluded, end of quote, or could be. Reading Mauss's book, Polymath, George Batal found something very different, proof of a mythical id economy of waste and loss hidden within the historical superego economies of production and accumulation. In 1933, in The Notion of Expenditure, he brought the potlatch into the present, not as a quaint memory of wholeness, but as a permanent psychology of dissolution. Batal seized on the potlatch as an expression of humanity's ineradicable attraction to recklessness, discharge, and upheaval. The immense travail, he stated flatly, that constitutes life. He was writing self-consciously as a Gnostic heretic, and that ineradicable attraction, he thought, was at the core of the heresy, deprived by Christianity and rationalism of all ordinary language, and now audible only in the brutest languages of insanity, crime, dream, perversion, war, and revolution. Batal told a new story, a story not all that different from the story of the Martian genes in 5 million years to Earth, fleeing the absolutes of the potlatch, in which value derived from the possibility of total loss. Humanity refounded civilization on the principle of utility and established a system of limits, where everything had its price. But whether civilization reproduced itself through barter, mercantilism, capitalism, or communism, it merely veiled humanity's inherent hatred of utility and limits, disguising its lust for, quote, unconditional expenditure, end of quote, for activities with, quote, no end beyond themselves, end of quote, concealed the truth that oblivion was humanity's ruling passion. The self-destructive man might be legion, but even at his most lucid, Bataille said, he imagines himself outside the human community, a crazy man. It does not occur to him that society can have, just as he does, an interest in considerable losses, in catastrophes that, while conforming to well-defined needs, provoke tumultuous depressions, crises of dread, and, in the final analysis, a certain orgiastic state, end of quote. In Moss, the potlatch was a shadowy performance of what once had been real life. Understood, it was a revelation of what real life would always be, even if that reality was now masked by a public culture of rational consumption, which hid the disfigurements of a secret culture, the bourgeois culture of family violence, adultery, incest, prostitution, lying, cheating, swindling, gambling, alcoholism, drug addiction, the modern dance of throwing away property. All that was left of the public potlatch, Bataille said, was the humiliation the bourgeoisie offered the poor. A humiliation the poor could give back only through revolution, by offering themselves for destruction, asking for a greater destruction in exchange. But the triumph of the bourgeoisie was sealed by its culture, which ensured that the real life of expenditure and loss would be pursued, quote, behind closed doors, end of quote. For the bourgeoisie distinguished itself from all other tribes, quote, by the fact that it has consented to spend only for itself and only within itself, end of quote. The result, Bataille said, was the disappearance of everything that was generous, orgiastic, and excessive, and its replacement by a universal meanness, the gift of a class so certain of its hegemony, so successful in identifying its history with nature, that it had finally dispensed with its mask, and against all that it still concealed, happily exposed its sordid face, a face so rapacious and lacking in nobility, so frighteningly small that all human life upon seeing it seems degraded. That was the ideal, the potlatch, the humiliation that could not be returned. The poor, caught up in the promise that someday they too might spend only for themselves, could not respond. Neither could so-called revolutionaries, communists dedicated to production for the sake of use, blind to the passion for expenditure for the sake of loss. All, Bataille said, were prisoners of the fiction of utility. And if a less arbitrary conception is condemned to remain esoteric, and if as such in the present circumstances it comes into conflict with an unhealthy repulsion, then one must stress that this repulsion is precisely the shame of a generation whose rebels are afraid of the noise of their own words. Bataille was laying down a challenge. 21 years later, the LI picked it up. All of these meanings were present when the group chose the word potlatch to name its second life, and in 1954 the group could find a meaning in the word that might have gone unnoticed 2 or 3 decades earlier. Everything that LI had to say, all of its yeses and nos, rested on the promise of a world of abundance. The potlatch tribes, Moss and Bataille had noted almost in passing, already lived in it because they were rich in meat and hides. They could afford to play a game of real life. Like the LI with its unexplained creation of situations, the Kwakutol and the Tlingit, with their ritualized exchange of affirmations and negations, reveled in abstraction. The potlatch was not merely a protean economy, it was a prophetic economy. As an absolute, the potlatch was an exchange of everything that could not be put on the market. For it to function, all commodities had to be taken off the market and raised above it, until the poorest trinket could symbolize the whole life of the tribe. So it would be when the new civilization came into being. God would be dead and everything would be sacred. Potlatch was just a metaphor, a means of understanding the way the small becomes huge, of deciphering, say, the inexorably rising stakes of a confrontation between a husband and a wife, the potlatch of complicity, Bernstein wrote in La Nuit, or the apparent lunacy of people burning their own town, the potlatch of destruction, as the SI said of Watts, or the sudden expansion of a solitary refusal into an explosion. A few troublemakers, a few cops, a riot, the army, then the social order called into question. But metaphors are transformations, proofs of the arbitrary nature of language, grants of mystery to ordinary things. They are, in other words, incipient utopias. For the LI, the appeal of the potlatch metaphor was in its ability to simultaneously symbolize dissolution and community, and its suggestion that the commodity could lose the magic marks had glimpsed in it. The table would once again be wood, still and powerless, but people would dance around it. That would be utopia, which would be a permanent potlatch of surprise. Walking the streets of the cities built for drifting, you'd meet other people, you'd exchange glances, then gestures, then words, arguments, agreements, insults, embraces. These situations would be open, made to be lived by their creators. Shaped by settings of reassurance and fear, there would be an intensity never before known in everyday life. You'd lose yourself in the oblivion of action. You'd know you were making it happen, like John Wayne and Montgomery Clift in their fight at the end of Red River. You'd exchange love and hate, life and death, like the tramp and the flower girl in the last shots of City Lights. You'd exchange terror and redemption, like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing night and day in the Gay Divorcee. You'd exchange hesitations and commitments, repulsions and attractions. Arlene Croach describes it. Abruptly, she turns and crosses the set. He blocks her. She crosses and he blocks her. She turns away. He catches her wrist. Their eyes meet and he dances ingratiatingly. Again she turns. Again he catches her and she walks into the dance. When she stands away, he pulls her by the hand and she coils against him, wrapping herself in her own arm as the free hand holds that wrist. In this position, together as if cradled, they just drift. This would be the new beauty, provisional and lived. Anything could happen. You would find out what happened next. There would be no repetition. Time would move and you would sense the passing of time, the accumulation of events that cannot be taken back. The necessary alienation, Debord said, and with that sensation you would come alive, because you'd be making your own history. The moment was temporary like everything else, like everything is, Paul McCartney once said of his years as a Beatle. Nothing in life really stays. And it's beautiful that they go. They have to go in order for the next thing to come. You can almost add to the beauty of a thing by accepting that it's temporary. To make this happen, that was what Debord meant by the wish to realize the collective art of our time, what the LI meant by the perfecting of a complete divertissement. From 1952 through May 1968, through all the furious step-by-step demolitions of every dominant image of the good, behind them all the obscure intimations of a new way of walking and a new way of talking, that was the Situationist project. That was all it ever was. I have tried to make the ethos that LI claimed into a narrative, to fill in the gaps, to make it at least half as clear as it was to Debord, Woolman, Bernstein, and the rest, inevitably to make their old papers into something fit for rational consumption. They didn't. The voice in Potlatch is unfailingly logical, but it's the logic of people so caught up in their own vision that it can explain anything to them. For anyone else, there are gaps in the logic that can't be closed, and the controlling gap was implicit in the medium itself. In 1985, Debord republished the complete run of Potlatch in a brightly typeset, cleanly designed book with a purple cover. It gives a sheen of likelihood, of investment and return to words that first trumpeted their messages of destruction and rebirth in a realm outside apparent possibility, dim and smudged on loose sheets of mimeo. The elegance of print empowers the most impossible sentence, translates its noise into at least a facsimile of discourse. But noise and powerlessness were a lot of what Potlatch was about. Those values were self-evident in the original form. In a book, they have to dismantle the orderliness of official culture all over again. Reading Potlatch today, especially the first 9 numbers when a weekly schedule held and the LI tried to say everything at once, is first of all confusing, even if one plumbs every illusion. What remains is spooky. A new civilization, it says in number 1, then in All the Water in the Sea Couldn't. Debord laconically summarizes the latest news on teenage suicides, the execution of anarchists in Spain, the execution of a rebel leader in Kenya, and the corruption of various French literateurs. What the latter need, Debord says, is the terror, which is what the former have already gotten. That's the implication anyway. The reader is back in 1794, which has turned into 1954, except that 1954 has turned 1794 against its rightful inheritors. Debord does not explain. Radio announcer, shoes for industry, shoes for the dead, shoes for industry. Pitchman, hi, I'm Joe Beats. Hey, what chance does a returning deceased war veteran have for that good paying job? More sugar and the free mule you've been dreaming of? Well, think it over, then take off your shoes. Now you can see how increased spending opportunities means harder work for everyone, and more of it too. So do your part today, Joe. Join the millions of your neighbors and take off your shoes. Announcer, for industry. A month later, with number 5, July 20th, 1954, the reader is back in the 13th century, which is also the future. The Cathars were right, announces a headline, running above a combat item on an American physicist's discovery of the antiproton, which subsumes a few brief dispatches on the CIA's coup against the democratic government in Guatemala. Save for the headline and a subhead, there is no commentary from the LI. The proton is the nucleus of the hydrogen atom, and in consequence constitutes the basic element of all terrestrial matter, Combat says. A proton and an antiproton, which will collide in mutual destruction. Thus, the antiproton will be capable of annihilating all matter composed of protons. In essence, this will be antimatter. Nevertheless, it appears impossible for them to combine with enough force to destroy the planet. End of quote. A nice touch, that nevertheless, although perhaps no solace to deposed President Jacobo Arbenz and his supporters, the silent subjects of the LI's conclusion. Le Figaro, quote, the new government of Guatemala will disallow the right of illiterates to vote, end of quote. Paris Press, quote, General Carlos Castillo Armas, head of the rebels who have gained victory in Guatemala, has been named president by the military junta, end of quote. La Humanité, quote, Castillo Armas defines his politics, the justice of the firing squad, end of quote.